In Rhodesia, the triumph of Mr. Mugabe. It's all right for the Africans, but what about the whites? From Salisbury. Mr. Mugabe's landslide victory here with a total of 57 of the 100 seats has left Rhodesia's white population fearful tonight. But Mr. Mugabe, in an exclusive interview with Newsnight, says he wants them to stay and he wants to join the Commonwealth. Down at Assembly Point Charlie, we watched the men who fought their way to power with Mr. Mugabe rejoicing at the political triumph that now ends their struggle. And Mr. Mugabe himself has driven the ritual prime ministerial drive through the governor's gates. But he waits a day or two for discussions before he forms what he calls his broadly based government. We talk to him, to Joshua Nkomo, and to blacks and whites here about Rhodesia's political transformation. Charles?
And here in London, I'll be looking at Mr. Mugabe's record, at some of the things he's been saying and doing all these years. And for the impact of Zimbabwe on southern Africa as a whole, John Tuso will be talking to Dr. David Owen, one of the architects of this development, and the High Commissioner of Zambia. In sport, David Davies follows the argument about British athletes in Moscow with the Minister of Sport versus Dennis Follows of the British Olympic Association. But most of tonight's programme is about Rhodesia, where, to remind you briefly, Robert Mugabe's party won an absolute majority, many more seats than anybody expected. Mr. Nkomo took second place, and Bishop Muzorewa came a poor third. The other 20 seats reserved for the white minority are controlled by Ian Smith. For today's developments in the wake of this result, here now is Peter Snow in Salisbury.
The speed of events here has been swift and quite stunning to the white Rhodesians, who were, most of them, even up to the last moment, hoping that there was a chance of a more moderate government. As for the blacks, they've quite simply taken off. The streets of Salisbury and the townships have been singing and dancing with people all day and all this evening. This evening, Mr. Mugabe made a television address in which he underlined his wish to create one multiracial society.
It must be realized, however, that a state of peace and security can only be achieved by our determination, all of us, to be bound by the explicit requirements of peace contained in the Lancaster House Agreement, which express the general desire of the people of Zimbabwe.
Some of the unhappiest Africans around today were the supporters of the last Prime Minister, Bishop Muzorewa, who's now left with only 3 seats. They were refusing to let anyone else anywhere near their headquarters, and there were scuffles in the streets. And some of the happiest people today were the guerrillas of Mr. Mugabe's ZANLA army. David Lomax was with them as the moment for the announcement of the results approached this morning.
In Assembly Camp Charlie, there are 1,500 of Mr. Mugabe's ZANLA guerrillas. They base themselves in a derelict mission only 10 miles from the borders of Mozambique and are surrounded by the wilderness of a vast tribal trust land. And there was also that now familiar sight of a Rhodesian security presence. There are 27 Rhodesian territorials here and a handful of British monitors who are staying on to help with liaison. Last night, the whole camp had heard rumours that their Mr. Mugabe was doing rather well at the polls. But it was only at 9 o'clock this morning that their hopes were finally confirmed in detail.
They gained 57 seats.
How do you feel about the result, the news of the result you just heard?
Well, I feel they are free and fair. They are very good and exciting. What you want now is unity. Since everything is over, I'm very glad bloodshed is now ended. And I hope everybody, part and parcel of this country, is going to follow the next government.
What do you feel about the result?
Well, I feel very good, feel very victorious.
This day of triumph at Assembly Camp Charlie has been an excuse for joyful celebration. But now that the fighting is over, one of the biggest problems facing the guerrillas and their new government will be how to set up a united Zimbabwean army after 7 years of civil war.
Meanwhile, with the army looking on, in the township of Harare, soon to give its name to Zimbabwe's new capital, just about everyone seemed to be a Mugabe supporter. Here in Harare, Mr. Mugabe will soon inherit these problems of housing and urban poverty, and people's expectations are high.
Mugabe is going to give people food, houses, farms, money and everything they want. And
what's Mr. Mugabe going to do for you?
Employment for my husband, betterment for my husband, schools, clinics, peace. I think that's the things that I want.
What will you do if Mr. Mugabe doesn't give you these things?
I don't expect it. I don't want to think about it. I'm sure he won't disappoint us. I'm sure of it.
Thank you.
We want a good and free country to live in.
And what else?
Jobs, good houses, better pay, and things like that.
Do you think Mr. Mugabe...
I'm very happy about the victory of Mr. Mugabe, and I'm expecting big changes, such as people in the squatters will be removed to good houses. In the jobs, we'll be having equal jobs, equal money, and everything like that. There will be no racial discrimination between people.
How will you feel if Mr. Mugabe fails to bring these changes?
Well, that we'll leave it to the people.
Within an hour of the news breaking this morning, Mr. Mugabe's supporters were pouring into the city centre. It wasn't a sight this smart and mainly European business section had seen before. Of all the possible outcomes of this election, this is the one the whites here had feared most of all.
I'd like to see if people are as jubilant this time next year.
I feel sick. That's all I can say.
Are you going to stay in Rhodesia?
I don't think so.
No. Where will you go?
I go to Britain, in spite of the weather.
A little worried. I'm hopeful that this will sort of stop the war. If it stops the war, then I'd live under any conditions, quite honestly. The war has been dreadful. I lost my husband. I have 3 children to support. I am worried because if he should nationalise, as has been said, I stand to lose everything.
No, actually, I'm not too happy about it at all. Because, you know, he's been responsible for, you know, his men have been responsible for lots of atrocities, you know, in this country. And also, he is a communist.
Well, I am frightened because I feel we've lost the war. We've been fighting for it, and all the things that everybody has fought for has gone. We've lost it.
Haven't you got any brains in your head to know what you've done?
How do you feel about Mr. Mugabe's victory?
I think it stinks, and the British stink with it because you've just given a victory to bloody Russia, you idiot.
Badly frightened Rhodesian whites, Mugabe was the one they feared most. In a moment, Peter Snow will be talking to Rhodesia's new leader and to the runner-up, Joshua Nkomo. Now, what about Mugabe? Is he really the demon, the black racist with red convictions that many Rhodesian whites apparently believe him to be? Or does his background and the record, what there is of it, point in a less intimidating, more hopeful direction? Who can say? But remember Jomo Kenyatta, the man who was loathed and feared by Kenya's whites as the Mau Mau leader, who became the father of one of Africa's most harmonious multiracial societies. Robert Gabriel Mugabe, the son of a carpenter and now 56, went to Roman Catholic mission schools. He won a scholarship to a black university in South Africa, where he got the first of 6 degrees in a year and became an African nationalist. He returned home to teach and taught for 4 years in Ghana, where he married and came under the radical influence of President Kwame Nkrumah. In 1960, back in Rhodesia, Robert Mugabe threw himself into nationalist politics, advocating bloodless revolution through propaganda and civil disobedience. He called himself a Marxist, but what drove him was not just ideology, but a simple resentment against white treatment of blacks.
The revulsion, I think, started through the stories that our parents used to narrate to us, how the white man came to the country, how he grabbed the land, and in a society where you have a class whose main purpose and accepted privilege is to exploit others, you naturally get revulsed if the majority of people are being oppressed, being exploited. You can't avoid, if you have any moral principles at all, the call to do something about it.
As black civil disobedience mounted, Mugabe was several times arrested. By now, he was calling for rule by an African majority. He said he would negotiate with the British, but not with the Rhodesian white majority. He denounced them as cowboys, and he was arrested for that. In 1964, the government cracked down on the whole black nationalist movement. This time, Mugabe was detained without trial for 10 years. He used his time in jail to teach and to study, passing 3 law exams. On his release, he slipped across the border to Mozambique, where the new Marxist Frelimo government gave him refuge. There he founded his own Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA. Many of his old comrades, some of them former fellow prisoners, joined him.
Pambereni Zanu, Pambereni Central Committee, the High Command, the General Staff, Pambereni Momo Zimbabwe, Pambereni Hondo, Pambereni Chimre.
By now, Mugabe was convinced that only violence would bring about radical change.
There was the whole history of our having tried non-violent methods. They had failed completely, and neither the settler regime nor Britain heeded our cries. They just wouldn't move. They wouldn't yield an inch. And so we decided, without any qualms about it, that armed struggle would be the right thing.
This is the voice of Zimbabwe. This is the voice of Zimbabwe, broadcasting on Radio Mozambique in Maputo.
All this time, Mugabe was using his Mozambique base to broadcast to his people, rejecting all the Smith regime's concessions, including the 1979 election.
We want full and unfettered democracy. Down with the racist constitution, down with the dirty elections, Pamberi Nechumrenga.
But the 1980 election was different. It gave him most of the conditions he'd demanded for years. Above all, a vote for every black and freedom to campaign for every political party.
But whenever...
From the start, Mugabe was sure he'd win, and that his use of armed force to secure free elections would in the end be vindicated.
In politics, you have to have an inbuilt system of shock absorbers. And I just don't care what they say, as long as I know I'm right. So they can say anything in their papers, damage me in every way possible, as long as the people I lead are behind me and approve of what we are doing. That's what matters. The rest of the world will one day, you see, be persuaded to believe we were right when we resorted to armed struggle.
Mr. Mugabe's election manifesto was greeted widely as a remarkably moderate document for one who many see as a man dedicated to a Marxist transformation of this country. But there are 2 passages in it which have led to fears on the part of the whites here. First, on industry and the economy. The manifesto says, a socialist transformation process will be brought underway in many sectors of the economy. And then on land, the manifesto says, a ZANU government will acquire as much land from the private sector as is necessary for the resettlement of the peasants who are currently on poor land or are without land. Well, earlier this evening, after his broadcast to the nation, as Rhodesia's Prime Minister-designate, I spoke to Mr. Mugabe and I asked whether we should now take it that this country will now lean more towards the Soviet Union and China than towards the West.
We are going to pursue a policy of non-alignment, but that does not deny us the right to be associated with members of either bloc on the basis of mutual understanding. We would want to see ourselves a member of the non-aligned movement and participate in the deliberations of that organization. We also would want to see ourselves become a member of the Commonwealth as well as a member of the United Nations. But in relation to the two blocs, we are going to be absolutely neutral. We'll make friends, of course, with members of either side.
What about your relations with South Africa? Are you going to provide shelter to armed guerrillas who want to fight against the South African government's policies?
No, I have already said that we are going to follow a policy, a realistic policy in relation to South Africa. Our view is that we cannot avoid South Africa. It is a geographical reality, and so a policy of coexistence is the best thing we can do. Our view is that South Africa should avoid interfering in our affairs, and we should avoid interfering in South African affairs.
So you won't support opponents of apartheid from here?
We will support opponents of apartheid only politically and diplomatically at the international forums. But it is not our duty to take up arms against South Africa. It's the right and obligation of the people of South Africa to correct their own grievances their own way. We can only assist by giving them political and diplomatic support.
So you're saying then that you don't see yourself in Zimbabwe as being a frontline state, as for example Mr. Michel in Mozambique was to Rhodesia?
Of course we are not a frontline state. The struggle in South Africa is a national struggle for South Africans, and not one we should regard as Zimbabweans as our own concern.
You will not support an armed struggle in South Africa?
No, we will not.
Can you tell us what your message would be to white people in Rhodesia now? They do have an image of you. We've been talking to them today as a Marxist, a communist who means to transform this economy and society. What is your message to them tonight?
Well, my message to them is that we would want to see them live in this country free from any restrictions, free from any victimization. To us, we cannot practice racialism in reverse. We just cannot do it in principle. As far as we are concerned, they're entitled to serve the nation as the blacks are entitled to do so. And hence we would want to see them develop a greater sense of security, greater sense of confidence, and greater sense of belonging. This is really our message to them.
You said you'd like to bring Mr. Nkomo into your government. Would you like to bring Mr. Ian Smith in to reassure the whites?
I would like to bring the Patriotic Front components together, and this means, of course, linking up ZANU and ZAPU in a coalition. It's not an exercise to bring Comrade Nkomo as a person, but because he's leader of ZAPU, we have a duty to bring him in. The question of bringing Mr. Smith doesn't arise, but our view
You mean you won't bring him in?
What I'm saying is that he should not be the concern. Our concern should be to try and create some deep sense of assurance on the part of the whites as a whole. And of course, it is not just Mr. Smith who can do that.
General Walls,
there are other people who can represent the whites as well. But we are discussing these matters, and I think we will reach some point of agreement with those who represent the white community.
General Walls, for example, you might ask him to be your commander-in-chief, might you?
I've had discussions with General Walls, and I have already given him our assurance that we do not intend to disrupt the services as they are. If we are going to effect any changes, this will take some time.
If you had to put your finger on one thing you'd like to change fast, what's that?
It's the position of the peasants. We would want to resettle them as quickly as possible, and the people who have been turned into refugees, who are either in urban centers or elsewhere, having fled from the war situation, and those who have gone out need a resettlement.
Does this mean taking European land?
It means, of course, acquiring land from the European sector, but here I must emphasize that there is lots of land which is unoccupied, which is underutilized, and land under absentee ownership. This is the land we are going to have to acquire, and in doing so, of course, we will be quite systematic and orderly and proceed according to our undertaking under the Lancaster House Agreement. That means, of course, compensate those whose land will be acquired.
And finally, how do you feel tonight?
I feel very overjoyed, but overwhelmed, as I have said. I think the victory we have achieved is a humbling one, and the weight of the responsibility that is now on our shoulders is not a slight responsibility.
The people who voted Mr. Mugabe into power were mainly the Shona people of eastern Rhodesia. In the eastern provinces, Mr. Mugabe won 56 seats to Mr. Nkomo's 5. In the western provinces of Matabeleland, that's the stronghold of Mr. Joshua Nkomo, he took 15 seats to Mr. Mugabe's 1. And the political divide at the moment looks very like a divide between tribes. Now, Mr. Nkomo, is this a country in two parts?
No, I don't think so. I don't think you're correct when you say the divide into tribes. Because if you talk of Shona and Ndebele, these are not tribes. These are a collection of tribes.
They speak different languages, don't they?
They speak different languages. There may be a variation of languages, but it is not correct to say Shona and Ndebele are two tribes.
Is there a danger that the divide, whether it's tribal or political or otherwise, in this election could have the seeds in it of a sort of even of fighting between you and the rest of the country?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that there would be fighting, and if there is a fighting, it would not be based on tribe or any divide of that kind. It appears, one would say this in the face of it, but I do not think so. You have got to consider that our party, ZAPU, which is Patriotic Front now, is not a tribal party. 90% of the members of the executive are what you call the Shona, the group of tribes under this terminology. So I don't think it is correct that one would say the consideration was of tribe, considering the setup of the executive.
Are you still very bitter at the campaign that Mr. Mugabe waged?
I never was bitter. That's one thing I don't have. Why do you think so?
You appeared at one stage, at a number of stages, to be referring to him as Idi Amin. I know you didn't mention him by name, but you did mention that Idi Amin was campaigning in Rhodesia.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say Idi Amin was campaigning. I said if there are people who compel you by force, who want to get votes out of you by compulsion, then you must be careful that you do not elect Idi Amin.
Who were you referring to?
I referred to people who did. It was not just
Mr. Mugabe.
One person. I'm not going to say those things. It was not just one person. It was not just one party. There were two or so parties that were doing that type of thing.
Well, whatever you felt at the time, what do you feel about Mr. Mugabe now? Will you join his government?
Well, that depends on our negotiations. We're going to talk about this.
But would you like to?
Well, it's not a question of liking.
He'd like you to.
Well, I don't think it's just liking to. It's the consideration of the importance of that arrangement in as far as the national affairs are concerned. So it's not a question of liking to, it's a question as to whether it would be to the national interest.
If he asked you to be president of the new Zimbabwe, would you accept?
No, no thanks.
Why not?
A constitutional president really is an inactive job, very inactive, and I'm not the type of person who would sit there for just this constitutional figurehead and that type of thing. No thanks.
So it's got to be a ministerial job?
I suppose so, yes.
What sort of job would you like?
No, we're going to discuss about that.
Finally, what sort of change would you particularly like to see in this country as soon as possible?
Well, the most important change in this country is that of our people recognizing themselves as one. What I mean is this: we have been divided into racial groups, white people, black people, so that all that was different, and be it in economic life, be it in ordinary social life, was based on this black and white. Once you change this and you make our people feel that they're one, then all those things that were divided along those lines could be solved.
Mr. Nkomo, thank you very much. Joshua Nkomo, who won 20 of the 80 African seats in the results this morning, making, of course, 20 of the 100 total seats in the new parliament, including the whites.
Peter Stowe there in Salisbury.